Howdy, I'm Garrett Myler, the owner of Enclave Defense, and in this video I'll be recreating a presentation I gave in July of 2020 at the International Society of Automation's Cybersecurity Standards Implementation Virtual Conference. This will be nearly identical to the original presentation, with minor changes made to the first and last slides to modernize my associations and contact information. This presentation is on understanding unmitigated cyber risk. At face value, unmitigated risk is fairly straightforward since it's basically what we are not doing to mitigate risk. But consider for a moment that it's usually easier to measure what we are doing than what we are not doing. These pictures offer a non-cyber example of unmitigated risk. On the left, we've got President Putin riding a motorcycle, and on the right is me tandem skydiving. Now, neither of us are wearing helmets, so we both have that unmitigated risk, right? Well, my favorite comedian, Jerry Seinfeld, has a great bit on risk mitigation that fits in nicely here. He jokes that when we as humans assessed the activities that were cracking our heads, instead of practicing risk avoidance, we chose to invent little plastic hats we could wear so we could continue our head-cracking lifestyles. Seinfeld also points out that the unmitigated risk in these two situations are fairly different. He says that when parachuting out of a plane, if the chute doesn't open, the helmet is now wearing you for protection. Afterwards, the helmet talks to the other helmets and says, "It's a good thing he was there, or I would have hit the ground directly." In this presentation, we're going to go beyond the surface and dig into how we measure and use unmitigated cyber risk. And I'll go so far to say that in the process, you'll realize that unmitigated risk may quite possibly be the most lively aspect of the 62443 standard series. The Kanye West of risk management, if you will. A bit controversial, but in an entertaining way. If you don't believe me, let's swap out these pictures. Unmitigated risk goes hand in hand with tolerable risk. And I think you'd agree that this pandemic has shown us how passionate folks can get about how tolerable and unmitigated risk is assessed and handled. Unmitigated risk is a subset of a detailed cyber risk assessment. So before we really dig deep into the variables of cyber risk, and specifically unmitigated cyber risk, it's useful to quickly review where a detailed cyber risk assessment fits into the broader ICS Cybersecurity Lifecycle. Now, technically, the 62443 standard series refers to what you see here as the security level lifecycle, but I feel that as a broadly scoped continuum, it's appropriate for dual use as a cybersecurity lifecycle. And apparently someone at ISA must agree, because while this is my own adaptation, it's nearly identical to a quote-unquote cybersecurity lifecycle I pulled from my own IC33 course. Now, speaking of training courses, for those who aren't familiar with the 62443 certificate program, the ISA course numbers that generally focus on each of the three phases are included here. While not depicted, the first course is IC32 and provides an overview of 62443 fundamentals. The assess phase is primarily covered in IC33, the development and implementation phase is covered in IC34, and the maintain phase in IC37. As a newly selected program instructor, I can't resist a shameless plug for this certificate program, which I'm excited to be a part of. This discussion takes place here, in the assess phase. As such, ISA IEC 62443-3-2 is our primary standard of interest. It's important to note that this standard is currently in draft form, and it's my hope that this webinar supports the development process. To understand unmitigated risk, a solid understanding of the variables that contribute to risk is necessary. In its simplest form, risk equals likelihood times impact, which is how we build out a risk matrix pictured in the bottom left. Now let's take a second to discuss impact versus consequence. While you may see them used interchangeably, 62443 differentiates the two and describes consequence as the undesirable result of an incident, and impact is the measure and quantification of that consequence. Most for-profit operations will likely use financial loss as the impact metric. The table on the right uses the 2010 BP oil spill as an example of consequences from the disaster with their corresponding impact measured in financial cost. You can understand the importance of impact when you consider that the consequence of one incident might be the plant shutting down for a week, while another could be an environmental disaster. When you're constrained by a limited budget, the ultimate goal is to be able to rack and stack risk in order to prioritize mitigation efforts, and measuring different consequences with a common impact metric, such as a price tag, makes the process that much easier. That said, calculating risk often becomes a voodoo math hybrid of quantitative and qualitative assessments, and that's okay so long as you're careful to apply valuations consistently. All right, so we've covered impact. What about likelihood? Likelihood of what? The likelihood of a given threat exploiting a specific vulnerability. So at least initially, risk is assessed by specific threat vulnerability pairs. While the vulnerability can vary based on mitigating countermeasures, the impact of the vulnerability being realized will remain constant. There have been a few tools developed to aid in quantifying impact and vulnerability. One such tool is the CARVER method, developed by U.S. Army Special Forces. CARVER stands for criticality, accessibility, recuperability, vulnerability, effect, and recognizability. While this tool is typically used for offensive targeting, a good risk assessor flips on their evil bit to think like an attacker and identify the vulnerabilities that could do the greatest damage. Lastly, we can break down cyber threats as the sum of resources and motivation. Notice here that we're adding these variables instead of multiplying, because anything times 0 is 0, and an insider threat that doesn't have malicious intent may be easier to defend than a highly motivated advanced persistent threat, but even a coincidental threat by an insider is still a threat that must be accounted for. It's important to note here that a big part of 62443 is the security levels associated with each zone or conduit of the ICS network. Each one has a target security level, an achieved security level, and the individual assets inside the zone or conduit have a security level they're capable of providing when properly configured. The security level describes the level of threat a zone or asset can or should be able to effectively withstand. So when we look at the descriptions of the 4 security levels in the table here, we see that they describe an unspecified threat with varying degrees of means, skills, and motivation. Now obviously, quarterly or annual vendor threat intelligence reports and other threat information received from information sharing and analysis centers and elsewhere are extremely valuable in assessing the threats specific to your facility. But if you're looking for some good reading material on threat quantification methodology, Sandia National Laboratories has a report on cyber threat metrics you might want to check out. All right, so we're just about ready to dig into unmitigated risk. As this detailed cyber risk assessment flowchart illustrates, once you assess your threats, vulnerabilities, impact, and likelihood, the next step is to calculate unmitigated cyber risk. Notice that considering existing countermeasures comes after your assessment of unmitigated cyber risk. Oh no, here comes Kanye West, and he says considering existing countermeasures is the greatest detailed risk assessment step of all time. So the drama begins, and like all good dramas, it starts with a definition. So there are a couple different ways unmitigated risk can be defined. I'll use this simplified risk spectrum to illustrate. On the left, we've got no risk mitigations or countermeasures, and on the right is the theoretical point where you've mitigated your vulnerability down to 0. The orange line represents your existing countermeasures and the amount of risk that is mitigated by them. In blue is your risk goal, which is primarily influenced by your security level target and the tolerable risk that exists to the right of it. So the question becomes, which of these 3 red lines here represents unmitigated risk? While a risk gap from your current countermeasures to your risk goal certainly demands attention, Calling just that gap your unmitigated risk has a tendency to create a false sense of security about your tolerable risk. Just because you've determined an amount of risk to be tolerable doesn't magically make it mitigated. So I'm not a big fan of this definition. The remaining two are more tricky because it depends from which perspective you're looking at risk. From the perspective of an asset owner considering their current real-world situation, it makes sense to measure unmitigated risk to the right of where your mitigated risk ends. But from a generic or theoretical perspective, including your existing countermeasures means it's not truly unmitigated, it's partially mitigated. The current 3-2 working draft uses this latter definition: the level of cybersecurity risk that is present in a system before any countermeasures are considered. Later in the draft, it clarifies that not just future intended countermeasures, but existing countermeasures should not be considered. And by the way, when I say cyber countermeasures, this should include those that mitigate human-enabled cyber operations, because the only non-cyber countermeasures are those that bear no impact on cyber risk. So if a visitor plugging in a malicious USB poses a threat to the network, then an escort policy and cabinet locks should be considered a cyber countermeasure. So what happens when we remove existing cybersecurity control measures? I'm talking no firewalls, no patching, and certainly no network monitoring or whitelisting. What happens? You're donezo, because your vulnerability is effectively set to max, which really stinks because when you think about it, your countermeasures are the one thing that you can really control. Hackers have their own priorities and limiting factors, and your countermeasures are the one thing that sets your ICS network apart from the attacker's other targets. Sometimes cyber defense feels like that old adage about escaping a bear attack. You don't have to be faster than the bear, only faster than the guy next to you. So vulnerability is maxed out, and as we mentioned earlier, the impact of a realized threat event is effectively a constant. So unmitigated risk is the worst case scenario of a given threat event if the attacker basically had carte blanche. But unless the zone or network you're assessing is truly absent of a single countermeasure, unmitigated risk is not the same as actual current risk. So using 3-2's current definition, you can use unmitigated risk to rack and stack theoretical worst case scenarios. But even then, the value of unmitigated risk is diminished by the fact that one threat event could do more damage than another, but actually be easier to mitigate. For example, a well-configured firewall might effectively mitigate a severe threat event, while a less severe one related to insider threat or social engineering may require more complicated or costly countermeasures. Now, at the risk of sounding like an algebra teacher, I want to stress the importance of getting each risk variable right and then using it appropriately. Due to the interdependent nature of all the many variables of our detailed risk assessment, if you get one variable wrong, that error is repeated and amplified every time it's used. For example, if you significantly underestimate your threat's resources, that means you've misjudged your threat, which will then skew your likelihood, which in turn skews the overall assessed risk. The cyber risk reduction factor serves as an example of what can happen when you get the variable right but misuse it. CRRF is closely related with your security level target and is a measure of the degree of risk reduction required to achieve tolerable risk. In other words, it's a ratio of the gap of where you are now in terms of defending a particular threat event and where you want to be. If your unmitigated risk is less than your tolerable risk, your CRRF is below 1 and you're good. Over 1 and you've got additional working countermeasures to deploy in order to meet your risk goals. Now, thankfully, y'all are muted because a few of you are probably screaming at your screens right now because we've made a critical error. Of course, using unmitigated risk in this equation means your CRRF is overinflated because unmitigated risk, as currently defined in 3-2, doesn't account for your existing countermeasures. To correctly calculate CRRF, we have to replace unmitigated risk with the current risk, which includes the existing countermeasures. It's my hope that this presentation has given you insight into what unmitigated risk is and how important it is to not only make sure you get each risk variable as accurate as possible, but to also use it correctly. Thank you.